The Man Who Kept Moving Closer. The smell of buttered popcorn never quite hits the same way it used to. Not since that Wednesday night in the fall of 2016, when everything I thought I knew about sitting in a dark room with strangers was ripped away from me in the span of about 90 terrifying minutes. It started like any other unremarkable college semester evening. My girlfriend Mia, my best friend Carlos, and my 10-year-old kid brother Tyler had all piled into my old pickup truck for a last-minute movie run. It was one of those cool October Wednesdays in Columbus, Ohio, the kind where the leaves are just starting to turn amber and rust, and the air smells faintly of chimney smoke. We had been meaning to catch the horror film The Hollow Road for 2 weekends running, but life kept getting in the way. A Wednesday night showing at one of those smaller, off-the-beaten-path cinemas tucked behind a strip mall on the east side of town felt like the perfect solution. I had no Thursday classes that semester. There was nothing standing in our way. The theater itself was the kind of place that time had slightly forgotten. The lobby carpet was a deep burgundy with geometric patterns worn thin by years of foot traffic, and the concession stand still used an old-fashioned cash register that clunked loudly with every transaction. We loved that about it. It felt like a place out of a different era, unhurried and genuine. On weekends, it would fill up, and we liked going later on weeknights specifically because we could usually claim an entire screening room to ourselves. There was a particular freedom in that, the ability to throw your legs over the seat in front of you, talk back at the screen, or react without embarrassment to the jump scares. When we pushed through the heavy double doors into the screening room, my first impression was that we had hit the jackpot again. The room appeared to be completely empty. The previews weren't running yet, just a quiet loop of old movie trivia slides, and the overhead lights were still on low. I remember thinking that this was going to be a perfect night. And then Tyler grabbed my sleeve. "Jake," he whispered, tugging me to the left. "There's somebody already in here." I followed his gaze to the upper left corner of the theater, the very last seat in the very last row, pressed against the wall as though trying to disappear into it. A man. He was wearing a dark charcoal hoodie with the hood drawn up despite the fact that we were indoors. His face was angled slightly downward, away from us, toward the blank side wall rather than the screen. I glanced at Carlos. He gave me the most casual half-shrug imaginable and kept walking toward our preferred section. Mia hadn't even broken stride. I told myself the same thing I imagine anyone would tell themselves. It's just a guy. People sit in weird spots all the time. Maybe he wanted total isolation. Maybe he was waiting for a friend. Maybe he just liked the corner. There was nothing objectively wrong with sitting in the back left corner of a movie theater. Nothing at all. We settled into our usual configuration, upper middle section, second row from the railing so we could prop our feet up on the metal bar. Because Tyler was with us, Mia and I left a seat open between us. I ended up on the aisle side, which put me physically closest to the man in the corner. At the time, that felt like a completely meaningless detail. The previews finished rolling. The lights dimmed to that deep, total darkness that only exists inside movie theaters and the bottom of the ocean. Tyler immediately produced a cellophane bag of gummy candies he had smuggled in under his jacket and began eating them with the enthusiasm and subtlety of someone operating a wood chipper. Carlos leaned over and told him to keep it down. Tyler ignored this completely. It was about 5 minutes into the film, right around the point where the opening tension was beginning to establish itself, when I heard something over the crinkle, crinkle, crinkle of Tyler's candy bag, a shifting sound, the soft but unmistakable creak of old theater seating, compressing and releasing weight. I waited a few beats, not wanting to be obvious about it, and then turned my head in what I hoped was a casual, distracted-looking motion. The man in the charcoal hoodie had moved. He was no longer in the corner seat. He was one full row closer to us. I turned back to the screen and stared at it, without processing a single frame of the film. My brain was already running probability calculations. Maybe he didn't like his original seat. Maybe the view was bad from that corner. Maybe he's trying to see around a pillar. These were all reasonable explanations. People switch seats during movies. It happens constantly. I was in a horror movie theater watching a horror movie, and I was letting my imagination chew on something completely ordinary. I made a deliberate decision to shake it off and re-engage with what was happening on screen. I lasted about 4 minutes. The sound happened again. That same quiet, considered shift of weight. I turned. He was another full row closer. This time I leaned sideways toward Mia and, keeping my voice at a low murmur, said, "Hey, don't look right now, but that guy in the back keeps moving toward the screen. Like row by row." She turned her head slightly, caught herself and looked back at me. Her expression was curious but not alarmed. She lifted one shoulder in a small shrug. So what? Some people are weird about seating. I agreed with her facial expression more than I agreed with my gut, and I turned back to the movie. But I couldn't let it go. The feeling had settled into the base of my spine, that low-grade, animal-brained awareness that something was misaligned. The kind of feeling that doesn't respond to logic because it predates logic by about 100,000 years. I told myself I would give it one more look. One more. And if he had moved again, I would say something. Firmly but calmly. "Hey man, you're making my group uncomfortable. Can you pick a seat and stay in it?" I rehearsed the words. They felt reasonable. They felt like the kind of thing a sensible adult says in a civilized situation. I turned around. He had moved again, but this time it wasn't just a row. He had also shifted laterally within the row. He was no longer at the far left end. He had scooted toward the center, toward us. He was 3 rows behind us now, and his head was tilted down so that his chin was nearly touching his chest, his face invisible beneath the hood. He could have been looking at a phone. He could have been looking at nothing. I had no way of knowing, and I did not particularly want to find out. I nudged Mia hard enough that she turned immediately. She looked behind us. She turned back. The casual neutrality on her face was gone. She leaned in close. "Do you want to move?" she said quietly. "Absolutely not," I said, and I meant it. Moving felt like conceding something. Moving felt like admitting that the dynamic in this room had already shifted in a way that was out of our control. I was 18 years old and full of exactly the kind of irrational pride that gets teenagers into trouble. And I planted my feet metaphorically and decided that I was not going to let some guy in a hoodie ruin the movie for us. What I should have done was get up, walk to the lobby, and find a staff member. What I actually did was sit rigidly in my seat, staring at a horror film I was no longer watching, while my neck prickled with the absolute certainty that the man 3 rows behind me was looking at the back of my head. Another few minutes passed. Tyler finished his gummy candies and announced, in the whispered but not really whispered voice of a child, that he needed to use the bathroom. He squeezed past me and disappeared up the aisle. I gave it about 60 seconds, then turned around. The row directly behind us was completely empty. He was gone. For one brief, ridiculous moment, I felt relief, and then my brain caught up with the timeline. Tyler had just walked out that door. The man had just disappeared. I was on my feet before I had consciously decided to stand. "Wait here," I told Mia and Carlos, and I moved up the aisle fast, hit the door, and stepped out into the hallway. The corridor was long and poorly lit, lined with framed promotional posters for films from the last decade. At the far end, maybe 60 feet away, the men's restroom was marked with a simple backlit sign, and I could see, just before the door swung shut behind him, the edge of a dark charcoal hoodie disappearing inside. I ran. I pushed through the restroom door, and what I saw in those first 2 seconds is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The man was on his knees on the tile floor, his upper body bent low, his face pressed toward the gap beneath the 2 stall doors, moving his head slowly from one to the other as though trying to identify which one was occupied. He looked up at me. At the exact same moment, from somewhere down the hall behind me, I heard Tyler's voice. "Jake! Hey, Jake! Over here!" I turned. Tyler was waving at me from the entrance to a second restroom, a smaller, single-occupancy one I had completely forgotten existed, tucked around the corner near the emergency exit. He had gone to the other bathroom. He had never been in this one. He was fine. I looked back at the man on the floor. He'd not moved. He was still looking at me. I let the door close between us and I walked, forced myself to walk, not run, back to the screening room. I collected Mia and Carlos with 2 words. "We're leaving." We went directly to the front desk. The young woman working the ticket counter called the police. Officers arrived within 15 minutes, reviewed the security footage, and a formal report was filed. The man in the charcoal hoodie was never identified. As of the last time I checked, the case remains open. Tyler never found out what happened that night. I'd like to keep it that way. The theater that shouldn't have been empty. There is a particular kind of courage, or perhaps a particular kind of stubbornness, that causes a person to go to the movies alone. Not the casual, self-assured solo moviegoer who strides in with their large soda and claims a center seat without a second thought. I mean the person who goes alone because they feel like they've run out of other options. The person who has been waiting weeks to see something and has finally decided that waiting for the right companion is just another form of not going at all. That was me in the late autumn of 2011 in a suburb of Houston, Texas. The movie was Dark Signal, a slow-burn supernatural thriller that had been generating serious buzz online for weeks. Every one of my friends had already seen it, somehow all seemingly within the same weekend, and each one had texted me some variation of, "You need to see this immediately." My roommate had gone on a Friday night. My coworker had gone on a Saturday afternoon. My neighbor had gone on a Sunday matinee. By the time the following Wednesday rolled around, and I still hadn't seen it, something in me snapped. I had Thursday off. I found a 9:45 p.m. showing at a small independent cinema about a 12-minute drive from my apartment. I bought a single ticket online. The parking lot when I arrived was almost entirely empty. 3 cars in the far corner, one idling near the entrance. Inside, the lobby was in that particular state of late evening wind down. Concession stand wiped clean, lights turned down slightly, one employee leaning against the counter and scrolling through their phone. They barely looked up when I handed over my ticket. The screening room itself was, and I want to be specific about this, completely, entirely not a single soul empty when I walked in. I stood in the entrance for a moment and just looked. Rows of red velvet seats, each one perfectly upright, unoccupied. The ambient pre-show music playing softly to absolutely nobody. I felt, honestly, a little bit foolish. The way you feel when you've gone to a restaurant for a birthday dinner, and you're the first one there by 40 minutes. Too eager. Arrived too early for a party that may or may not materialize. I made my way to my preferred positioning, the bottom row of the upper section, right behind the small half wall that divided the seating levels. I settled in, propped my knees up, and decided to embrace the solitude. A private screening. This was actually kind of great. The previews rolled. The movie began. I gave myself over to it. For about 20 minutes, everything was fine. Then, during one of the film's quieter moments, a long dialogue-free scene of a character walking through an empty house, I heard something. It was faint. At first, I was almost certain it was coming from the film itself. Some ambient sound design meant to unsettle the audience. But the sound on screen was still and muted, just the creak of floorboards and the distant hum of a refrigerator. And this sound was something else. It was coming from behind me. It sounded, and I realize how this is going to sound, like someone whispering. Not talking. Not muttering. Whispering. The deliberate, airless kind of whisper that people use when they don't want to be overheard. Low and rhythmic and close. I turned around completely, in my seat. The upper rows of the theater were empty. Every seat upright, every armrest bare. I could see the entire upper section from where I sat, and there was nobody there. I told myself it was the HVAC system. Old buildings have weird acoustic properties. Air moves through ductwork in ways that, under the right conditions, can sound startlingly human. I have convinced myself of stranger things. I turned back to the movie. The whispering continued. Over the next 10 minutes, it grew incrementally in both volume and clarity. What had begun as a barely there breath of sound was becoming something I could no longer attribute to building infrastructure. It had a pattern. It had cadence. It had, and my stomach drops every single time I revisit this part. It had direction. It was coming from the rows immediately behind and above me. Somewhere between 2 and 4 rows back, angled slightly to my left. I turned again. I was thorough this time, standing up partially, leaning over the half wall, looking down each row individually. Nothing. I sat back down. My hands were cold. My attention had completely abandoned the film. I was sitting in a dark room that should have been empty and listening to a sound that shouldn't have been there. And the two facts were pressing against each other in a way that felt increasingly urgently wrong. The whispering got louder, and then I stood up. I don't entirely know what made me do it at that specific moment. Whether it was some survival instinct firing, or simply the accumulated weight of 10 minutes of growing dread reaching a threshold. But I stood, turned to face the upper rows directly and looked. A figure rose from behind the seats approximately 2 rows above me. Not slowly, not gradually, fast, the sudden, fluid, upward motion of something that had been crouched and waiting, arms pressed flat at its sides, posture rigid and completely unnatural, like a person pretending to be a mannequin who had suddenly forgotten to keep pretending. It just stood there, facing me, motionless, no words, no movement, no expression I could make out in the dark. I did not scream. I did not say anything. I turned and I ran. The lobby was empty, not just unstaffed, genuinely eerily empty. The employee who had checked my ticket was gone. The concession stand was dark. I ran through the lobby, hit the exterior doors with both hands, crossed the parking lot without looking back, and got into my car. I sat there for 30 seconds breathing hard, with my doors locked and the engine running, before I pulled out and drove home. I called the theater from my apartment that night. The phone rang 12 times before I gave up. I tried once more the following afternoon, out of some lingering obligation I couldn't quite name, and again no one picked up. Eventually, I decided to let it go. I have not let it go. Not really. Not even close. The man in the brown jacket. Working a service job at 16 teaches you things that no classroom ever will. It teaches you that people are strange, It teaches you that the social contract most of us take for granted is, in fact, a fairly fragile and voluntary arrangement. It teaches you that the hours between 10 p.m. and midnight in a small commercial space with minimal staff are when the voluntary part starts to slip. I worked at a movie theater in Parsippany, New Jersey the summer I was 16. It was a decent job for what it was. Decent pay for the area, no dress code beyond the polo shirt. Decent manager named Ray who left us alone as long as the floors were clean, and the tickets were collected. I ran the ticket podium most nights, which meant I spent a lot of time standing near the entrance, collecting stubs, pointing people toward auditorium numbers, and waiting. I got good at waiting and at watching. There was one night toward the end of that summer, a Monday close to 11 p.m., that I have never stopped thinking about. The last two films of the evening were wrapping up simultaneously, which was unusual. Normally, there was a staggered schedule that kept people trickling through until closer to midnight. But that particular Monday, both late showings had started at the same time and were finishing together. The multiplex was emptying out faster than usual. I was the only floor staff working. Donna, the woman who ran the concession stand, was still in the building. I could hear her back there rattling the popcorn kettle and bagging up the unsold inventory for closing. She had been talking about heading out to drop her car at the shop 2 blocks down, which had agreed to take it late, and she had told me she'd be back within the hour to finish the closeout paperwork. I was sitting on the carpeted steps next to my podium, hunched over my phone playing one of those color-matching puzzle games, when the front doors opened with a force that didn't match the hour. Not violent exactly, but deliberate. Purposeful. The kind of push you give a door when you want to make an entrance rather than just an entry. I looked up immediately. A man was standing in the doorway. He was somewhere in his late 40s or early 50s, heavyset, wearing a large brown canvas jacket that had faded unevenly across the shoulders. His eyes found mine before he had finished taking his first step inside. And I mean found mine. Not scanned the room. Not adjusted to the dim light. He looked directly at me, specifically like he had known exactly where I would be. I set my phone down. "We're closing up," I said. "Last showings are just finishing. You're welcome to wait for anyone coming out, but we're not selling any more tickets tonight." He didn't respond right away. He walked a few more paces into the lobby and then just stood there, looking at me with an expression I couldn't classify. It wasn't angry. It wasn't friendly. It was the particular expression of someone who is making a calculation, weighing something, deciding something, while making sure you know that the deciding is happening on their terms. Then he said, very quietly, almost under his breath, "Is Donna here?" My stomach did something I didn't have words for yet at 16. It contracted, not a dramatic drop, more like a slow tightening. "She's in the back," I said, "but she's heading out. Is there something I can help you with?" He just shook his head slightly as if the question didn't quite merit an answer. "I'm just going to sit down for a few minutes," he said, and he walked to the long upholstered bench along the far wall of the lobby and sat down heavily, spreading his arms across the back of it, and looked at me. I picked my phone back up. I was not playing the puzzle game anymore. I was texting Donna. "Hey, there's a guy out here who asked for you by name. Kind of weird. Just wanted to let you know." The problem with the flip-style phone I was using was that it had a slight delay between sending a message and the delivery confirmation, and another delay between delivery and someone actually checking their phone in the middle of restocking the kettle. I was staring at the screen, willing it to show me the little delivered checkmark, when I made the mistake of looking up. The man was watching me, not glancing at me, not looking in my general direction, watching me, straight on, unblinking with the relaxed focus of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing else to look at, and didn't particularly care whether you noticed. I felt the color leave my face. I wanted to project confidence. I wanted to show him that I was not fazed by this, that I was in charge of this space, that he was a visitor in my professional environment, and I was the authority here. So I stood up, and I walked up the 3 carpeted stairs to the upper lobby level, and I sat down on the bench near the wall that would put the corner of the concession stand between us and break his line of sight. I sat there for about 90 seconds before I realized what I had done. I had removed him from my view without removing myself from the building. I had no idea where he was or what he was doing. The corner that was shielding me from his gaze was also shielding him from mine. I had, at 16 years old, and with the best of intentions towards self-composure, made myself functionally blind to a man who was making me deeply, instinctively uncomfortable. I came back around the corner within 2 minutes. He was gone. The bench was empty. The lobby was empty. The front door was closed and undisturbed. There was no sign of him anywhere. Donna came back about 20 minutes later, right around the same time the last of the evening's audience was filing out. I told her about the man, and she winced slightly and said she had left the door unlocked by mistake, which tracked with the way he had come in, and that I probably didn't need to worry about it. She put me to work on the final sweep of the auditoriums, collecting cups and wrappers from between the seats. Then she asked me to carry the cleaning equipment, mop, bucket, push broom, down to the storage room in the basement, a below-ground space accessed through a door just off the main lobby. I gathered everything up, pulled the basement door open, and started down the concrete stairs. The storage area was low-ceilinged and L-shaped, lit by a single bare bulb with a pull chain. It smelled of industrial cleaner and the specific damp concrete smell of spaces that don't get much air. I was halfway to the utility shelf when something stopped me. An arm. Visible from behind the large boiler unit in the far corner of the room. A human arm, pressed flat against the wall, half hidden behind the boiler housing, completely motionless. I looked at it for 1 second, maybe 2. Then I set the mop and bucket down gently. I turned around. I walked back up the stairs at a perfectly normal pace, trying very hard to make no noise that would indicate I had seen anything, and I locked the basement door behind me from the lobby side. I found Donna at the concession counter, and I told her as calmly as I could manage that there was someone in the basement. She looked at me with a complicated expression and went immediately to the security monitor behind the counter, a small CCTV feed from the lobby cameras. She pulled up the stored footage from the past 40 minutes, and we watched together as the man in the brown jacket, just minutes after I had moved behind the corner and lost sight of him, stood up from the bench, walked to the basement door, opened it, and went downstairs. The camera didn't show the basement, but it showed that he had gone in and had not come out. Donna was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That's my ex-husband." I felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. The situation had just become something different from what I had thought it was. It was no longer a stranger making me uncomfortable. It was a story with a history I didn't know and stakes I couldn't see. Donna took out her phone. She didn't call 911. She called him. The conversation lasted less than 20 seconds. From what I could hear, she said his name twice, asked him to come out, said please once. Then she went quiet, and her face changed, and she lowered the phone. He had hung up. She called 911. I only heard fragments of what she said to the dispatcher because she had stepped partially outside. But I followed her because I was not about to be alone in that building. I caught pieces, came to the theater, threatened her. Man named. Parking lot, possibly. When she ended the call, she grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the entrance, out across the parking lot toward the far curb. Then she told me. Her ex-husband had apparently run into a situation. The word she used was situation, delivered with a weight that suggested the real word was something much more serious, involving a man he had owed money to. This man had reportedly made it clear that if he couldn't collect from the ex-husband directly, he intended to collect from people close to him. Donna was the person closest to him. Her ex had come to the theater that night not to frighten her or harm her, but because he had heard, through whatever channels his life had given him access to, that someone was planning to come to her that night. He had come to warn her, and then, for reasons I will never fully understand, instead of knocking on the door and explaining himself, he had gone into the basement and hidden behind the boiler. 2 police cruisers pulled into the parking lot with their lights on. Officers went inside. Less than 10 minutes later, they came out with another man in handcuffs, someone I had never seen before, an older man in a dark jacket with an expression of practiced indifference, a man who, according to what Donna told me after, had been waiting in a car in the adjacent lot and had apparently started moving toward the theater when the police arrived. Donna never came back to work after that. Ray, our manager, told us only that she had taken some personal time, and then, 3 weeks later, that she had moved on to other opportunities. I never got the complete version of the story. I never found out what the debt was, or whether it was settled, or what happened to either man after that night. What I do know is this. Somewhere in the sequence of events that unfolded on that Monday evening in late summer, in Parsippany, New Jersey, I walked alone into a basement where an unknown man was hiding, and I walked back out without letting him know I had seen him. I don't know if that was the right call. I don't know if there was a right call. I just know it worked out. What we carry out with us. I want to tell you about the aftermath, not the police report, not the security footage, not the practical, procedural aftermath that follows any incident that crosses the line from discomfort into genuine threat. I want to tell you about the internal aftermath, the thing that stays with you in your body long after the event itself is over. Because here is what nobody warns you about when it comes to experiences like the 3 I've just described. They don't really end, not in any complete sense. They get smaller, the way most things do with time and distance and the diluting effect of ordinary life layered on top. But they don't disappear. They become part of the architecture of how you move through certain spaces. For me, it's movie theaters specifically. There is no other environment that triggers it quite the same way. Not parking garages, not empty streets, not unfamiliar buildings. Movie theaters, the smell of the concession stand, the way the lights dim, that specific shade of near-total darkness that exists only in screening rooms, and that is objectively one of the more vulnerable physical positions a person can voluntarily put themselves in. You sit down and face away from most of the room. You give your senses over to a screen. You signal, by the simple act of being there, that you are occupied, absorbed, present in a way that is pointed away from whatever might be happening behind you. And most of the time, the overwhelming, statistically enormous majority of the time, that is fine. Most of the time, the person behind you is just watching the same movie. Most of the time, the sound you think you hear is the air conditioning. Most of the time, the stranger in the corner seat stays in the corner seat, watches the film, and leaves when the credits roll. Most of the time. What changed for me after that October night in Columbus wasn't a permanent wariness or a phobia I had to manage around. It was something subtler than that. It was an awareness, a recalibration of what I was willing to dismiss. Before that night, if something felt slightly off in a public space, I had a reliable mechanism for talking myself out of it, a kind of internal committee that would review the available evidence, pronounce it insufficient, and send me back to whatever I had been doing. After that night, the threshold for what I was willing to dismiss shifted. Not all the way to the other extreme, not to paranoia, but to something more honest. The man in the charcoal hoodie moved 9 rows in approximately 30 minutes. He didn't do it quickly. He didn't do it aggressively. He did it the way you do something when you want to avoid triggering the alarm. Slowly, incrementally, in a way that could plausibly be dismissed at any individual moment as innocent. The horror wasn't in any single move. The horror was in the pattern, and the pattern was only visible if you were paying enough attention to notice it. I almost wasn't. The figure in the Houston theater never spoke to me, never touched me, never made any explicitly threatening gesture. If I had told someone about it the next day, the story would have sounded borderline ridiculous. A person stood up from behind some seats and just stood there. That's it. That was the whole thing. And yet, every single cell of my nervous system knew, in the half second before I ran, that something was catastrophically wrong with what I was looking at. The body has its own intelligence. It speaks in a language that predates words. The problem is that we are trained relentlessly from childhood onward to override it, to be polite, to be reasonable, to not make a scene. The problem with not making a scene is that some scenes really should be made. Donna's situation was the most complicated because the threat in that case was layered. It wasn't the man in the basement who was the danger. It was the man in the parking lot he was trying to warn her about. The person who looked suspicious turned out to be acting out of some misguided, destructive, deeply flawed version of protectiveness. And the actual threat was sitting calmly in a dark car less than 100 feet away, waiting. That's the thing about danger. It doesn't always announce itself with the right face. I think about Tyler a lot when I revisit that first night. My little brother, walking down the hall in the opposite direction from the man in the gray hoodie, toward a different bathroom, completely unaware that his safety had just been determined by something as arbitrary as which direction he happened to turn. He was 10 years old. He was eating gummy candies. He had absolutely no idea. He still doesn't know. I've thought many times about whether I should tell him. He's older now, old enough to handle the information, old enough to understand what it meant. Part of me wants to tell him because it feels dishonest, somehow, to have carried this specific thing alone all these years. But another part of me, the part that watched him walk toward me down that hallway, waving and confused and completely fine, wants to leave it exactly where it is. Some things are better preserved in the not knowing. I want to leave you with something practical rather than something frightening, because I don't think fear is actually the useful takeaway from any of these stories. Fear makes you freeze. Fear makes you second-guess the instinct at the exact moment when acting on it would help you. What actually helps is a different thing. It's smaller and quieter than fear, and it doesn't require anything dramatic. It's just this: pay attention to patterns, not just moments. 1 seat change is nothing. 2 seat changes is a coincidence. 3 seat changes in the same direction in the same increments, toward the same group of people. That is a pattern, and patterns are where intent reveals itself. The individual moments can always be rationalized away. The accumulation of moments cannot. Trust the feeling that something is wrong before you can explain why. The body assembles information faster than the conscious mind can process it. The hair that rises on the back of your neck, the cold that moves through your hands, the specific quality of alertness that feels different from ordinary interest. These are not imagination, and they are not weakness. They are your nervous system doing its job. Let it do its job. Remove yourself from the situation before you try to solve it. I was 16 years old and alone in a lobby with a man who was making me uncomfortable. And instead of leaving the building immediately and calling someone, I sat down on a bench to manage the optics of the situation. That was the wrong call. The right call is always exit first, explain later. You can apologize for overreacting from outside the building. You cannot take back whatever happens if you stay inside, and it turns out you weren't overreacting. You are not responsible for managing a stranger's feelings about being asked to leave or being reported. This is the one that I think trips people up most consistently, and honestly the one I struggled with most in my own experiences. There is a deep social conditioning, particularly, I think, in younger people and in people who were raised to prioritize others' comfort, that makes it incredibly difficult to take an action that might upset or embarrass someone else, even when you have a legitimate reason to take it. The fear of causing a scene, the fear of being wrong, the fear of overreacting and looking foolish in front of everyone. Here is what I want to offer as a counterbalance to that fear. The cost of overreacting is embarrassment. The cost of underreacting can be something you don't come back from. These are not equivalent risks. Please stop treating them as if they are. The 3 stories I've shared with you tonight all resolved. I want to be clear about that. Nobody in these accounts was harmed. My brother was fine. I got out of the Houston theater without incident. Donna made it to the parking lot before anything happened, and the police arrived in time to change the shape of whatever was about to unfold. But I also want to be clear that the resolution in every case was not inevitable. It was contingent. It depended on specific choices made at specific moments. A child randomly choosing a different hallway, a decision to run instead of freeze, a text sent to a coworker during a quiet moment that made sure someone else knew something was wrong. Any one of those small pivots, turning the other direction, and the ending looks different. I go to the movies still. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I love movies. I love the experience of a dark room and a big screen and a story unfolding in front of you in surround sound. I'm not going to let a handful of evenings that went wrong steal something I love. But I go differently now. I notice differently. I give my instincts a seat at the table that I used to deny them. And I always know where the exits are.